Welcome to the deep dive. We dig into the sources, sift through the research, and really try to pull out the insights you need. Today, we're diving deep into some material that really challenges how we think about, everything, existence itself. We're talking about the inner structure of the self, consciousness, this whole multidimensional reality idea, and it's all drawn from these really extensive communications apparently given through someone in a deeply dissociated state.
That's right. We're zeroing in on insights from this entity called Seth, channeled through Jane Roberts, who went by Rupert in the material to her husband Joseph.
Yeah.
And what makes this stuff so extraordinary is that it's not just abstract theory about consciousness. It tries to lay out a kind of blueprint for how the physical world actually emerges from non-physical stuff. It's like a map to realities way beyond what our physical senses can normally pick up.
Okay, so our mission here is to give you a shortcut, essentially. We're boiling down the key nuggets about, the link between our everyday physical reality, what they call camouflage reality, and the real job of your inner self. And this really surprising idea about dreams not just being dreams, but having their own independent existence. If you're listening, you're probably ready to look under the hood of everyday life, and we're here to kind of guide you through this architecture of existence they describe.
Yeah, just to show we're jumping right into the deep end, here's maybe the most fundamental claim right off the bat. The sources basically say that the entire physical universe you see around you, everything solid, everything you can measure, seemingly fixed stuff.
Yeah.
It's all the result of constant, ongoing inner processes. Its existence, its maintenance is as automatic and necessary for your reality as breathing is for your body. It's this act of constant creation happening moment by moment.
Okay, let's unpack that because that's a huge leap, right? If reality is being made from the inside out constantly, why does it feel so solid, so fixed and definite? This brings us straight to what they call the camouflage pattern. That's their big metaphor for this limited reality.
Exactly. The camouflage pattern, that's their term for the physical universe, and that includes time and space, as we usually experience them, linear. Think of it like a very sophisticated filter, but one that's highly specialized. Our outer senses, sight, sound, touch, all that they say, these are basically perceptors of camouflage. They're just tools designed specifically to focus on and confirm the materialized, the dense part of reality, or what they call action.
I have to jump in here because, my skeptical side kicks in. If I put my hand on this table right now, it feels completely solid. Are the sources really saying this table isn't intrinsically solid, that the solidity is just my perception? Is that right? And why is that perception so convincing?
That is exactly what they're saying. The material is pretty insistent. The table is not solid. It's described as an aggregation of energy units, right?
Yeah.
And it only appears dense within our specific field, our slice of reality. And crucially, it's the perception of its solidity, yours and mine, and everyone's collective agreement, that keeps our hands from just passing through it. The physical structure, as we perceive it, doesn't exist outside our plane, our shared expectations. So if you only rely on evidence from these outer senses, these specialized tools, you automatically shut down the much broader, more complex inner senses that can perceive the deeper stuff underneath.
Okay, so that makes the difference between inner and outer senses absolutely critical. If the outer ones just see the camouflage, what are the inner senses picking up on? What realities are they engaging with?
Right. While the outer senses look outward, registering the camouflage, the inner senses reach inward, deep inward. They deal with the realities underneath those patterns, and they're constantly feeding huge amounts of data about these inner realities back to our core self. This is where, real non-physical perception starts.
And these inner senses aren't just like abstract ideas. The sources suggest they actually work like the outer senses for a hidden self-conscious self. What's the connection between that hidden self and our normal, everyday waking consciousness?
That's a really key structural point. This hidden self-consciousness is usually separated from our ordinary conscious self, what we call the ego, by the subconscious. That's the layer in between. But in certain states, apparently, this hidden self can actually look out through your physical eyes onto the camouflage world. The sources use this analogy of looking through a telescope. The subconscious is like the long, narrow tube of the telescope. And that narrowness, that's deliberate. It's a limitation, but it serves as a vital buffer.
A buffer. A buffer against what? Getting totally swamped by how complex reality actually is.
Exactly that. The main job of the subconscious, acting as that narrow channel, is moderation. It dials things down. If the full, unfiltered fire hose of inner reality just poured straight into the conscious ego, well, the ego couldn't handle it. It would probably just dissolve. It wouldn't be able to function in the linear, focused way needed for the physical world. Because the inner senses, unlike our physical ones, they operate as if time and space just aren't constraints. They're the mechanism for things like projection, clairvoyance, that kind of instant, non-physical knowing that the ego, in its current state, just isn't built for.
Then the sources take this inner self structure and link it to the physical world using an electrical metaphor. We seem to jump quickly from perception to the electrical nature of things. It sounds like they're saying the physical body has to be constantly connected to some kind of independent electric field.
Yeah, the material is very clear on this. The physical body doesn't just exist in one field, but in many fields of actuality all at the same time. And that's why they argue you can't really understand the body or psychology just by looking at the physical stuff, like only studying the brain's effects. The brain is presented as just a small part of the total mind, the part that's sort of visible within matter, and it follows physical laws. But the brain is more like the receiver, not the source itself.
So the mind itself is independent of the physical field, but it still exists within it somehow. How does this electrical universe connect them?
Right. The mind is considered way more fundamental for study than the brain, but you can't really analyze it with just physical instruments. The electrical universe is the bridge, the intimate connector. Nerve impulses are described as constantly jumping, leaping across, connecting the physical field with this electric field. That's what sustains the illusion of physical continuity.
So if I have a thought or a really vivid dream, it's not just brain chemistry firing. It has its own electrical reality that sticks around.
Absolutely. Within the mind, a powerful thought, a focused intention, even a dream, has a definite electrical reality. Now, within the brain, yeah, it registers as an electric and psychological event, but the electrical reality of that thought itself continues to exist independently. It's codified. Our physical body's identity is tied to this bigger electrical field, which they say is responsible for growth, overall being, that sort of thing. And parts of this electrical universe, you could call it your electrical self, are projected out into countless other fields of actuality, which means your identity is much, much broader than what you're consciously aware of. And this electrical self, it acts as a perfect bridge to the deeper self, which I think is where we need to go next.
Okay. If our core identity is electrical and projected out into multiple fields, this is where it gets really complicated, isn't it? The self isn't just one thing, it's partitioned. How do the ego, the inner self, the I who dreams, and this thing called the entity, how do they all fit together?
All right, let's start with the ego, because that's the part we know, the part we experience most directly. The sources actually call the ego a pseudo-identity. It's formed for purely practical, utilitarian reasons. It's the survival mechanism, the part that helps you navigate traffic, remember your keys, deal with focused physical reality. And it's constantly changing, getting knocked around by physical stress and situations. It has this tendency to try and set itself apart from the flow of action, to become this self-conscious observer looking at action like it's something separate, something alien.
That sounds pretty restrictive, and the sources seem to imply that our usual idea of ego consciousness being so rigid is actually limiting because it relies on ignorance.
It is limiting, precisely because it depends on maintaining barriers, walls, essentially. These barriers separate parts of the self from each other, and they stop the ego from being completely overwhelmed by all the experiences of its other selves. The ego, uniquely, is the part that's aware of past, present, and future as definite, separate, linear things.
But hang on, if the ego's job is basically to protect us from being swamped by all this simultaneous reality, all this future projection stuff, isn't trying to break down those barriers kind of dangerous? Couldn't it lead to, mental breakdown? Did Seth ever talk about the risk of just overwhelming the physical mind?
That's a really important question. And yes, they do address it. It comes back to the subconscious acting as that buffer. The goal isn't to just get rid of the ego, but to mature it, expand it. The ego has to keep its specialized ability to focus and operate in linear time, but it needs to become flexible enough to handle more data. The sources talk about aiming for an altered ego, one that can kind of afford to step outside itself for moments. It gains experience by letting in more inner data, by experiencing itself within the flow of action as part of it, not separate. When that balance is right, the danger isn't really there in the same way.
Okay, so that expanded ego state then leads us to the I who dreams the inner self. How exactly does this inner I manage to shift its focus and escape linear time and space?
All right, so when you dream, what's happening is the inner self changes its point of focus. It shifts. The sources specifically call the destination a subconscious area. They actually prefer that term over just subconscious layer, which they feel is too vague. This shift in focus is the key mechanism that takes the inner self outside what they call camouflage time and space.
Yeah.
And because it's no longer bound by those limits, the inner self can then view the self as a whole, including past lives, present life, and crucially project itself into what we perceive as the future.
So the inner self is living in this kind of simultaneous reality, totally separate from the linear time the ego experiences. And when you gather up all these simultaneous realities, all these other selves, that's where we get to the entity.
Precisely. The inner self is aware of itself having experiences across a huge variety of realities simultaneously. These vast experiences are collected, you could say, as other selves or probable selves. And all of these separate selves ultimately merge into this profound organizing principle they call the superconsciousness or the entity. And there's a really foundational statement here in the material that action, working upon itself, becomes consciousness. The entity represents that ongoing action of consciousness, just observing and experiencing itself across all possible fields.
Let's dig into that idea of simultaneous existence a bit more, because it leads to this concept of probable selves and the inverted time system. That sounds completely backward from how we usually think about cause and effect, past causing present.
It absolutely is a profound reversal. The sources explain that the subconscious, which is deeply connected to this probable self idea, operates within an inverted time system. What that means is, in this system, events that haven't happened yet in your present, these future possibilities, they already have a kind of reality structure. Choice actually comes before linear manifestation, not after it. And this structure explains how you, as an individual, are constantly in touch not just with your past experiences, but also with events that haven't occurred yet in your present timeline.
Wow, so we're not just reacting to the past, we're actually accessing and maybe even shaping future possibilities right now. Does that mean the future is fixed then, or just probable?
It's defined as highly probable, definitely not fixed. The self is constantly forming the events of the past, even as it forms the present and the future. It's dynamic. There's this ever-expanding field of probabilities, and from that field, the conscious physical self, you choose the thought patterns you weaved into the physical stuff of your universe. The entity, operating in that inverted time system, sees all the potential paths, all the probabilities. But there's a key warning the material gives. If the ego were to become consciously aware of a definite future event, like something absolutely set in stone, that awareness itself could allow them to change it, which just reinforces that reality is fundamentally about dynamic choice and experience, not some predetermined fate.
Okay, shifting from the entity to the dream state. We usually just brush off dreams, right? Random brain noise, maybe symbolic psychology stuff. But these sources treat the dream universe like an actual independent place, another field of actuality. What really stands out to you about this idea of dream energy being permanent and independent?
Well, the first thing is that they say our word dream is just totally inadequate, doesn't capture it. Seth actually suggests using the term hybrids or sometimes dual hybrid constructions. This refers to personalities, objects, even individuals that mankind gives existence to in dreams. And the crucial point is, these are not imaginary. They aren't just fleeting symbols or myths. They exist as actual reality within another distinct field, a field structured by psychic energy units.
So wait, if I dream up a really detailed place, or even a person in a dream,
Right.
that thing I created keeps existing somehow, even after I wake up and forget the dream completely.
Yes, that's exactly the claim. Dream objects, dream creations, they maintain some level of independence from the dreamer. This happens through a process the sources call value fulfillment and psychic expansion. Value fulfillment basically means that energy, once you project it and give it a form, it has to continue fulfilling the inherent nature, the values of that form. These things start at psychic energy, and any energy that takes on a form has to, at least for a bit, adapt to the laws inherent in that form. So the energy persists, it continues in existence, it doesn't just evaporate, even if the physical dreamer totally forgets the dream landscape or the person they met.
That almost makes the dream world sound like a practical workshop, a place where you can actively solve problems without the slow, heavy limitations of physical matter.
That's precisely one of its key functions. When you're facing complex problems in the physical world, the inner self often builds out many possibilities in the dream world. It tries out different solutions to physical problems on a dream basis, and those potential solutions become actualities within that dream field. They exist just as surely as if the dreamer had acted them out physically. The inner self is incredibly efficient, using this dream field like a parallel reality lab.
There's a really interesting anecdote in the sources that illustrates this complexity, isn't there? Involving Joseph's dreams about his father and how they were connected to Rupert dreaming about a leaking vessel. It shows how this nonlinear stuff flows between people.
Yes, that specific example is really important for understanding the different areas of the subconscious they talk about. Joseph had two separate, quite vivid dreams involving his father. The sources explain that the first dream sequence came from a subconscious area focused more on past lives and old associations. And yes, it was partly triggered by Rupert's telepathic input for her dream about a leaking vessel, which apparently symbolized energy loss or distress. It just shows how tight that telepathic link can be between people who are close, like Joseph and Rupert were.
And what was the specific meaning they gave to his father's actions in that first dream?
In that initial dream, Joseph's father walks by, he smiles, he nods, but he doesn't say anything. And that silence was significant because it reflected the often difficult, unspoken aspects of their real-life relationship. Seth interpreted the nod as a kind of general blessing for Joseph, suggesting acceptance, maybe reassurance, coming from that realm of past associations. Now, Joseph later got worried that this was some kind of clairvoyant warning about his father's death being imminent. But Seth corrected him, saying that the underlying knowledge that his father would eventually die contributed to the image of him passing by, but it was not immediate, definitive clairvoyance of death right then.
But the second dream did have definite clairvoyant information, and it came from a different subconscious area.
Exactly. The second dream came from a different subconscious zone, one more tuned into future physical events. And it did contain a clear, clairvoyant warning. This dream was apparently to prepare Joseph for something specific happening. The coming Sunday, a real-life situation where he would have to, quote, sit in judgment, probably make some tough decision. But the sources also warn here that interpreting dream data consciously is often tricky. It gets distorted, because the mind sees a distortion when a mental act gets projected into the physical field, like their example of seeing a tree reflected in wavy water. The reflection is distorted, but the tree is still real.
Okay, let's shift focus now to how they actually got all this information. The whole communication process itself, with Jane Rupert in a trance state, is described as this difficult, ongoing experiment. How did the trance state actually work? How did she achieve it, and what did it do to her ego psychologically?
Right, the sources are very specific. This trance wasn't like standard self-hypnosis. It's described as Rupert essentially switching internal channels, deliberately focusing on an objective inner stimulus, which in this case was the entity, Seth. Dissociation is the key step here. It breaks what they call the tight vice of the ego. The ego, being so focused on physical survival in linear time, can kind of build up around our inner vitality like a rigid glacier. These psychic exercises, the trance work, were intended to help melt that rigidity, allow more flow. And Jane often reported feeling fully dissociated. She'd use phrases like feeling far out, or say the energy felt completely external, not hers. She even described sensing two separate lines of consciousness running at the same time, her own awareness and the distinct energy of Seth speaking through her. That dissociation, that mental flexibility, seems to be what's needed for this kind of high-level psychic data transfer.
And Joseph, who was taking all the notes and observing, he recorded some really specific physical effects when Jane was deeply dissociated, didn't he? These incidents sound like pretty spectacular, almost undeniable evidence of some external force being channeled.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Apparently, Seth himself wasn't particularly in favor of physical effects, thought they were a bit distracting from the main message, but he agreed to them specifically to convince the skeptics, especially Rupert herself, who he jokingly called a well-known doubter.
Yeah.
And yeah, the most dramatic and well-documented one is the table hopping. Happened with several witnesses present.
Tell us about that table hopping. What was the actual physical nature of the force they observed? Was it just things moving?
So during a deep trance session, the heavy writing table they used just started moving violently, hopping, dancing around the room. Joseph and Rupert literally had to get up and walk alongside the table to stop it from crashing into the floor and getting damaged. But the crucial part was when the table tipped up onto just two legs and kind of hovered there for a moment. Trying to force it back down onto all four legs took extraordinary effort. This wasn't just passive levitation, it was active resistance. The witnesses described having to push down hard against this completely unmistakable invisible force, a repulsion, they said, like trying to push the opposing poles of two strong magnets together. It was described as a tangible, almost geometrical force working directly against gravity.
Wow. That's an incredible level of physical manifestation. What about observations of Jane herself, the medium, beyond the table moving?
This might be the most chilling detail, actually. One witness, Bill McDonnell, who apparently had a strong scientific skeptical background, he described seeing eyes superimposed on top of Jane's closed eyelids. He said they had no visible pupils and were clouded, almost like cataracts. And even weirder, whenever Jane, in trance, spoke and gestured towards Joseph, This eye effect literally followed her gaze, tracked with her gestures. It suggests some kind of visible physical signature of the consciousness transfer happening. Joseph noted other changes too, like her voice getting deeper, more resonant, her eyes seeming darker, more luminous when open briefly. But that superimposed eye thing was only seen by the external witnesses.
And to try and bring some discipline to this, they relied pretty heavily on ongoing clairvoyant experiments, right?
Well,
Specifically those double-sealed envelope tests. How did those attempts to formalize the input work, and what did they reveal about how Seth was actually getting the information?
yeah, the procedure was quite rigorous. Joseph would carefully seal objects with strong emotional connections, maybe sentimental items, letters, things like that, inside double envelopes. Then Jane, in trance, would hold the sealed envelope to her forehead and try to get impressions, identify the contents or their meaning. Seth stated that his ability relies mainly on picking up the emotional charge linked to the object. That's the primary data stream. This raw emotional info is then kind of processed, disciplined, translated by his intellect before it gets delivered verbally through Rupert.
But the results weren't always perfect, were they? We know there were distortions, what they called boo-boos. Why wasn't perfect clarity possible, even with these careful methods?
Yeah, distortion seems unavoidable, especially in the early stages of trying to communicate between two very different realities. Seth explained it by saying that data coming in through the inner senses, when it gets forced into the physical medium, it's like a mirror image which must be deciphered. He used that powerful analogy. A mental act projected from the non-physical into the dense physical field gets seen in a distorted way, like looking at a tree reflected in water that's constantly rippling. The distortion doesn't change the underlying truth of the tree, the act itself, but it makes the interpretation, the verbal description, really difficult and prone to error. The sources really emphasized that given the tools they were working with mainly, a physical human body being used as a temporary instrument, these kinds of errors were just bound to happen sometimes.
What's really striking about this material, too, is that it's not just high-level theory. It includes incredibly specific practical advice for Joseph and Rupert, guidance on how to integrate all this profound knowledge into their actual daily lives, right down to work schedules and what they should eat.
Absolutely. This whole section really emphasizes application. The core message for creativity, for making this work, is the need for this peculiar mixture, as they put it, of discipline and regularity with spontaneity. The regular schedule for the sessions, that commitment to doing it consistently, was seen as necessary to keep the channel open and strong. But rigid thinking, being too inflexible, that was actively discouraged. True creative breakthroughs, they said, come from that balanced structure and freedom. Ironically, the sources even suggest that without Rupert's slightly rebellious nonconformist streak, the highly disciplined sessions might never have gotten off the ground successfully.
And this balance was applied really directly to their work habits, wasn't it? Especially for Joseph, who needed that solid, uninterrupted time for his writing and art.
Yes, Joseph was told pretty firmly that he should not be disturbed in the afternoons, except for really unusual emergencies. His privacy during those focused creative hours was called very important because of the nature of his work. And Seth actually offered practical tips for maintaining that boundary, suggesting Rupert should just mentally picture Joseph working somewhere else, out of the house maybe, or simply that Joseph should close his bedroom door, creating a clear temporary division in their apartment during work hours to protect his focus.
And for Rupert, the advice was even more detailed, focusing specifically on managing his energy levels and how that directly impacted his physical health symptoms.
Right? Rupert's personality, the material says, was specifically structured to handle really high energy intensities, high voltage, you might say. He was instructed to set aside just one specific day each week for the business side, marketing manuscripts, the rest of his time, fully dedicated to working on his 2 books he had going then. And crucially, he was told he had to actively demand that the energy he needed was available, to avoid what Seth called false starts and interruptions.
Yeah.
Because when Rupert was working at his full power, really using that intense energy, he was described as being essentially outside the reach of physical symptoms.
So those physical symptoms he reported, like sore muscles, chronic tension, they were basically a result of unused creative energy backing up.
That's the direct implication, yes. When he failed to use that high-intensity energy properly, maybe procrastinated or held back on his output, he essentially unconsciously punished himself with these negative symptoms. They're described as actual blocks of energy causing physical distress. The link is portrayed as very direct. Underusing your core psychic energy can create physiological problems.
What were some of those really specific, almost quirky health suggestions he received?
They got really granular. He was told to avoid fried foods and specifically tomato juice in the morning because the acidity was apparently aggravating for his system. On the other hand, apricot was mentioned as being soothing, and he was told he needed to eat more fresh salads. Also, too much whole milk was actively discouraged. It shows this incredibly fine-tuned connection they saw between subtle dietary things and handling high-intensity psychic energy.
And lastly, how was he supposed to handle those negative physical symptoms when they did pop up, especially as these blocks of inner associations were supposedly being released?
Right. The sources explain that negative symptoms often flare up when these old blocks of inner associations naturally start to break down and release. To help that process along, Rupert was advised to absolutely not concentrate on the symptoms, even if he was trying to wish them away. Directing attention away from the symptom was framed as the key mechanism for withdrawing the energy that was sustaining that negative physical state. He was also strongly encouraged to take frequent brisk walks, make it a daily thing, to kind of refresh the inner self and physically break up those negative energy patterns. Ideally, a complete change of scene would have been best, but just altering habits and patterns within his existing environment was considered enough to help manage the energy flow better. Hashtag tag 7, conclusion and final provocation.
Well, this deep dive has given us just an astonishing perspective on reality, hasn't it? From that camouflage pattern we mistake for solid ground, to the self being this multi-layered thing, ego, inner self, entity, and dreams being actual independent fields of action.
Yeah, and the ultimate direction all this knowledge seems to point towards is integration. The sources consistently talk about how, through enough experience across all these different levels of existence, the inner ego and the outer ego are meant to come closer together, to merge more. And as that unity happens, the subconscious, that buffer zone, will eventually just disappear entirely because it won't be needed anymore to filter reality.
And the sign of progress, the measure of expanding consciousness, is how much those self-imposed barriers come down.
That seems to be the key metric, exactly. The extent to which you can shatter those limitations, those perceptual illusions. Those are the sparks, they say, of your expanding consciousness.
Hmm.
Identity, the sources really affirm, isn't dependent on just physical existence. And the ultimate reality is that consciousness itself comes before and goes beyond the limits of just intellectual knowing.
What really stands out to me, though, wrapping this up, is that claim about action itself. The sources state action never has just one effect. Never. And if an action seems like it only has one effect, they suggest that points to a fundamental lack in our perceptive abilities, a failure to see the ripples spreading out across all those other fields of actuality. So as you take all this in today, maybe consider this. What actions are you performing right now that are having profound effects, psychic, electrical, maybe even shaping probabilities far, far beyond what your conscious mind perceives?